Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the co-owner and creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and in this video, I want to talk a little bit about boundaries. Boundaries are probably the single most underrated predictor of whether or not our relationships are healthy long term. It may not be the greatest predictor of whether the relationship works or not, because there are a lot of relationships that last for very prolonged periods of time where both parties have very poor boundaries or one party has very poor boundaries. But in terms of the actual health and thriving of the relationship, this makes a massive impact. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today. There's so much I can say about boundaries, and maybe I'll do a series. We have a course coming out in the Personal Development School for April about boundaries, and really it's about the different types of boundaries, how boundaries exist in the 7 areas of life, the different types of boundary violations we have, which are self or other, as well as action or non-action. There is a whole bunch to do with how we need to set up our boundaries, how we can identify our boundaries, how we can actually communicate them to others. Boundaries are one of the most important things, and there's so much to say about them because a boundary is essentially an expression of our truth, right? It's the expression of our feelings and needs. Setting boundaries allows us to actually love more deeply and connect more deeply because we show ourselves in our vulnerability. It takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability to set a boundary, especially if you've grown up in an environment, which the majority of people have, where boundaries are not acceptable. You're not allowed to express feelings and needs in childhood, or children are meant to be seen or not heard, or you can't have any needs because you're supposed to be an obedient child to your parents. And there's so many different dynamics that put us at this sort of boundary deficit. And when we don't have boundaries, our relationships cannot function in a healthy manner. So what I'm going to go through in this video is, as I was listening, there's so many parts to boundaries and healthy boundary setting. But what I'm going to go through is just like at a very surface level, how to identify boundaries and some boundaries in the 7 areas of life. Okay, so just a little exercise here that we can do together. So before I jump right into the content, we are also doing a stay-at-home sale for everybody just to support everybody during COVID. I'm trying to make a daily video as often as possible, and it is 25% off. The coupon code is with you. It's all one word. And it's to anybody who's like staying at home, wants to work on themselves, build a relationship to themselves. It's the best time to do this, to be quite honest, because you want to sit during your time here where you're isolated at home and be able to take something away from it. And so, whether it's working on yourself through the school, whether it's just working on yourself in general, whatever form that takes, a really great question to ask yourself is like, well, I'm sitting here and I don't have full control over so many things the way that I used to. What can I control and how can I grow from this experience? And by intentionally choosing something that empowers you, you're going to feel a lot better about this entire time. So, I was going to say one other thing about this, and I can't remember what it is. But anyways, let's go into the content. So first and foremost, we have 7 core areas of life. These 7 core areas, you've probably heard me mention them before, are your career, your career, physical, financial, mental, emotional, spiritual, and relationships. And relationships comes into 3 sort of subcategories. Relationships are your friendships, your family relationships, and your romantic relationships. Then we have different types of boundaries, okay? And the boundaries that we have are our mental boundaries. So there is some overlap here, right? Our mental boundaries are like our thought boundaries. What are our opinions? Are we violating our own mental boundaries because people just give us their opinion and we just accept it and repress ours as a result? Or do we actually take the time to consider other people's opinions, see what lines up for us, do some research, and really check in a way that takes us into consideration while we're making decisions, okay? So much of what boundary setting requires is the art of being able to take yourself into consideration as you choose. So whether it's, choosing an opinion, choosing what you're feeling emotionally when you're in relationship to somebody else, like what you're taking on and not taking on. An example of the art of taking yourself into consideration is maybe you poor emotional boundaries. Maybe you always forget where you end and somebody else begins emotionally. And the act of taking yourself into consideration allows you to be a proper empathizer in a healthy way. It allows you to be able to go, oh, like I see that they're going through that. I empathize with them. I feel for them. I care about them. However, it's not my duty to fix all of their pain. If they want to ask for help or if I can offer help, and they can give me specifics and we can work together in a way that I can support them, that's beautiful. But for me to just take on somebody else's emotions and then suffer because they're suffering, it's like saying, oh, because you're bleeding, I should cut myself too, right? It doesn't work like that. We want to be able to be like, how can I help you? Can I get you a Band-Aid? Let's communicate. What do you need? But you're not sitting there suffering because somebody else is suffering. You're empowered to take action and communicate healthily to help and support the prevention of them continuously suffering. But you're not taking it on. You're not like, oh my God, my finger hurts so much because their finger is cut, right? We don't, there's nothing healthy about that, okay? This is a big topic. Like I could go into this for a very long time about our emotional boundaries, but I'm just going to do some like high level stuff here so you get the whole picture, okay? So the different types of boundaries we have, we've got our thought boundaries, which are sort of like our mental boundaries. We've got our emotional boundaries, okay, which is like how much responsibility we take on for people's feelings, how much we sympathize with people's emotions instead of empathize, right? Sympathizing is like, I feel exactly what you're feeling. Empathizing is like, I can connect and put myself in your shoes. I can feel, but I can maintain staying rooted and grounded in my sense of self too, and be clear about how I can support without just taking it on and suffering unnecessarily, right? We have our time boundaries. So a time boundary violation might be something like a friend asks you to help them move something or to take them to the airport, and you say yes, but you really mean no because you are already burnt out or overwhelmed or swamped. And whenever we betray our own boundaries because we don't check in, we're not able to in real time in the moment, it creates resentment instead. And that's why, as I was mentioning at the beginning of this video, it's so important for us to be able to consider ourselves and have healthy boundaries. The lack of healthy boundaries are the breeding grounds, like excessive breeding grounds for resentment in a relationship. And when that happens, relationships usually don't end well. And so, or they can go on for a long time, but they're highly dysfunctional. And so this is what I mean by like, we need to be clear about what our boundaries are. And often, like when we say yes to ourselves instead of deny our boundaries, like saying no to somebody else basically can be a yes to yourself, if that makes sense, right? And a yes to myself might be me showing up honestly in the relationship so that we can both like fully see and hear and understand each other as long as the other person's doing the same. And the lack of that is me actually building an invisible wall. When I say no, but I mean yes, and I lie through actions or behaviors, even not meaning to, right? Not trying to be dishonest or untrustworthy, but just because maybe I don't understand the concept of boundaries, or I think I don't deserve, or I'm not allowed to say no. And by the way, we have all these limiting beliefs that prevent us from setting boundaries too. I don't deserve, I'm going to be a burden, I'll lose connection. We have all these stories in here that creates the lack of our boundaries. But if I don't show up honestly because I don't set a boundary, then I just built an invisible wall between me and somebody else. And so it's really important from that perspective to recognize, okay? So we've got our mental boundaries, emotional boundaries, time boundaries, our physical boundaries, okay? Our physical body, our physical space, our home, our material boundaries, our belongings, or our money. And then we've got our sexual boundaries. So this is really clear, right? So what you want to be able to do when you're looking at all these different types of boundaries here is you want to be able to look at the 7 areas of life and define ahead of time where you're violating your own boundaries, okay? What am I doing? Why do I violate my own boundaries? Why does this take place? Like what are the root causes of this? What beliefs am I carrying that are creating the lack of boundaries in my life? And you can even look at like in terms of when you look at all these different areas, you can look in the 7 areas of life. So for example, you're like binding the 7 areas of life with the 6 different boundary types together. So you can imagine you look and you're like, okay, career, where do I violate my mental boundaries in my career? Where do I subordinate my opinions to my boss, for example, and not speak up when I have an opinion in a meeting? So these are your thought beliefs in your career, right? You see? My emotional boundaries, where do I worry too much about how people are doing and if they're under pressure and I take on everybody's work and violate my own emotional boundaries because I'm like sympathizing with people and taking on all their pain and feeling responsible for how they feel. Okay, my time boundaries, where do I say yes to extra work after work is over when I really mean no because I'm already burnt out or whatever might be going on, right? And it's not wrong to like work a little harder, things like that from time to time, but you have to do that when you take yourself into consideration, maybe half an hour once a week is okay, but maybe 3 hours every single night when you go home from work is absolutely not. So you have to get clear about taking yourself into consideration. Again, it's not like emotionally empathizing with your coworkers is bad. But when you emotionally empathize with your coworkers and then don't consider yourself because you can only feel their feelings and you got lost in yours, then you got enmeshed with them in their feelings and yours, then all of a sudden you're doing all these extra things, right? So we have to go through and we want to look in each of the 7 areas. How are we showing up with our mental, emotional, time, physical, material, sexual boundaries? Okay. And start there. There's different types of boundary violations. There's ingoing and outgoing, self and other, action and non-action. There's so much more to say about boundaries. So if you guys are interested, I will definitely put like a little boundary series together. I have a 3-hour course on this inside the school that's in extreme detail about like everything you can do, how to subconsciously reprogram your relationship to boundaries, how to wipe out the core beliefs that are preventing you from setting boundaries effectively. And it's such an important part of how we relate to others. And boundaries impact our self-worth more than almost anything else. Why? Because even if my internal dialogue is on point, like even if I'm kind to myself and how I speak to myself throughout the day, if I'm going through life and I'm constantly putting people ahead of myself, what would that feel like if somebody did that to me? A partner in a relationship was constantly putting everybody before me at my expense. Even if they're being nice to me with their words and they're right, the reflection of my internal dialogue, as the analogy goes, even if they're being nice to me with what they speak or what they say, if they show up to me that way in actions, I'm going to be like, you don't think I'm worthy. And so even if we're on point with our own way that we speak to ourselves in our mind and we do work there, if we do not show up in the actions we take in the relationship to ourselves and we don't take ourselves into equal consideration as we do others, and it's not higher or lower, it's just equal. If we're not working on that or working through that, then we are diminishing our own self-worth every time we don't set a boundary as well. We're making our needs totally unworthy. They don't matter, right? So think about what that does in relationship to yourself and your worthiness. So I hope this all makes sense. I know I did a high level video about this, but it's such a deep concept and there's so many layers to boundaries. But I hope this is a great place for you to start. Please ask me any questions you have in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.